complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, before I welcome our guest on, I'd like to announce that this is another episode sponsored by Axios Fitness. Instead of rolling the normal kind of sexy ad that we have, I'd just like to tell you that if you follow the link in the description, you can find the exact same workout I actually use every single week that JD designed for me, and he's releasing it along with a special coupon code for my audience. So if you want to check it out, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching, that's the place to go. But anyway, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. Drawthentic, how are you doing, man?
Good, thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you on. I would say I've spoken to, a lot of different kind of corners of the right, but I've been, like woefully like undercovering kind of like the right wing art scene. So if you could, obviously, I guess I've kind of spoiled it, but could you describe kind of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm an artist. I have a Twitter account. You can find me if you look me up on Drawthentic, but also you can just check the description. I mostly make art about an imaginary future America that's not as garbage as this one. That's how I describe my work.
Yeah, and I will say it's obviously difficult for me to show art on a primarily audio podcast, but I will say your style is quite striking. And to me, even before I met with you or I spoke with you, it was very apparent that you had kind of a unique eye and a unique, sense of, a possible future where our guys win. But before we get into that, just for the sake of kind of providing more context, how did you get here? Like making art on the internet.
Yeah, I didn't used to post art. I was just more of a political wonk. I started listening to Sargon of Akkad way back in the day, around the Gamergate days. And then I moved on to more politically reliable people like Alternative Hypothesis and Edward Dutton and Academic Agent. And in 2022, I started uploading to Twitter more often, but I didn't have much of a following until I happened to message Paulos, who is @MythPilot on Twitter. And he retweeted some of my stuff, and that got me going. I ended up getting retweets from people like Raw Egg Nationalist and Bronze Age Pervert. And I only started uploading more art because I got more of a following. It was kind of a chicken and egg sort of deal.
So are you a classically trained artist, or are you self-taught?
I'm self-taught. I've been drawing for like 6 years now, but it's all self-taught.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because I was not in art school, but I had the distinct pleasure of being friends with a lot of kids who were in kind of the art programs at my university. And I don't know how to put this, but there's a vitalism in your work that is distinctly lacking in what I saw in kind of the regime approved tract. So I know that you kind of hinted at this, but what are the things that you think make your art different than kind of the more, I guess, like approved, artists and illustrators?
Yeah, it's obviously subject matter. I draw a lot of one thing is that a lot of characters are openly armed. Like, if for many years now at this point, I've been trying to kind of open carry is seen as a sort of, cringe redneck sort of thing to do. But I want to shift open carry into a more, like back in the Middle Ages where you'd carry a sword around your hip and that was what you did. It wasn't a statement or anything. That was just what you did. So that's one thing that makes my art a bit different, is just the ubiquity of weaponry. Another thing is that I make it pretty obvious what's going on in the artworks. I realized when talking to my associates that sometimes the peons just don't get it unless you spell it out. So for example, a lot of the characters are wearing bulletproof clothing, and written on an obvious place on the clothing is a brand name like Ballistic. So it's obviously indicating that the clothing is ballistic in nature. And that, what does that imply? A bulletproof coat that has, bright colors and patterns on it instead of being, camouflage. What implies that armor in my fictional world has transcended mere, field utility, and now it's something that people wear every day. And so that's kind of what I aim for. I want to aim for a sense of a new everyday where the things that are happening in my artworks are just common occurrences in that world. They're not unique.
Sorry, I had a little bit of internet issue, and I think that I wasn't out for too long. I think I still have it. But one of the things that struck me in this is that you've mentioned kind of the you want to make kind of like arms and armor every day in a way, and that idea of being a martial culture in an older way, because there's this mechanization and like industrialization of modern war. And look, like I'm a gun autist, I understand that, but there is something about kind of like the pre-World War I era, right? And this is often brought up by fans of kind of like the Napoleonic era, right? Where if you look at a soldier now, and every soldier in the world, carries something that looks kind of like an M4 and wears something that's pretty much multicam, which for people who aren't versed, basically everyone's soldiers kind of look the same. Whereas, in a previous era when, this martial tradition was tied to cultural identity, every single army had, like a different set of, kind of like colors and units and all of these things that made it very vibrant. And I realize I'm describing it like a video game, which is not necessarily how I want to, but there's this beautiful kind of like cultural distinction in that, that in both, obviously, in kind of the more direct cultural outputs of things like art and music, there was cultural distinction, but also in kind of like arms and armor. And that's one of the things that I've noticed and appreciated in your work, is that, in this world you've created, there are distinct civilizations. So could you describe those different civilizations and kind of like the motifs you use to express their difference, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to answer your earlier point about the fact that previous cultures had more sort of distinct, outfits and branding, to use a modern term. For example, in the English Civil War, there were, of course, the Roundheads, who were the parliamentarians. They're the ones who wanted to make England a democracy, basically. And there were the Cavaliers, who were the old-style aristocrats, the feudal lords, sort of, who wanted to keep the old monarchical order. And they were distinct in that the monarchical forces, the Cavaliers, they still had their heraldry and their family house colors and whatnot, whereas the Roundheads, they were the new model army. They all wore munition-grade armor. They all wore the same colors across all of England, no matter what town they came from. And so that was kind of one of the first instances where armor and insignia kind of became workmanlike, as Bap likes to say. And that's been, the case for a variety of reasons for a few hundred years now. But going forward, I think it's going to change, because just like in Dune, the problem is that if you do manage to make armor that truly works against bullets, bullets no longer really much of a threat anymore, then that changes the way the game is played. And the Ukraine war has shown that camouflage is less important, because each side has a hard time detecting who is friend and who is enemy, especially in urban combat. And so you just need bright colors to distinguish that quickly, which is exactly what happened in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, you were fighting in close quarters, so you needed to see who was who quickly. But yeah, to answer your actual question about description of different civilizations, you can kind of break how I think, well, not how I think, but how America and my world is broken apart into several chunks. You have, going from the worst option, you have like the communists in, the People's Republic of California. I don't think anyone's going to disagree that if America shatters, California will probably still be how California is now. But then you have a sort of Nietzschean civilization in the Pacific Northwest. people say it's impossible because Seattle's blue. I'm not really concerned about that. The thing about Nietzscheans is that they take what they want. That's what they do. And then on the East Coast, alternatively, you'd have a sort of not Catholic, but kind of in the same vein as a sort of like trad cath, theocracy, monarchy sort of deal called Atlantica. And then in the middle, I think that the middle will be kind of contested zones. So I have what I call the conglomerate of independent states, which is kind of, it's not the Confederacy, but it's kind of a similar thing where a bunch of states just agree that they don't want to be ruled by any of the other forces on the playing field. And so they operate together against a takeover.
And one of the things that I like about, this world you've created, and I find it evocative, is that people from different places, these different civilizations, they dress differently and they look differently. Because I think, to me, one of the genuinely like heartbreaking things about modernity is the fact that the vast majority of places are essentially the same, or becoming more the same, right? Is that if I took all the signs down and asked you to pick out, well, okay, I realize this isn't a perfect example. I was going to use Seattle because there's probably a smell to Seattle, but asked you to pick between, like a certain segment of, downtown Manhattan, downtown London, or any numbers of other like first world cities, right? There are still distinctions, but they're becoming less and less. The people look more and more the same. And so returning to a world of distinction, I think is a very evocative thing.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason that people, like all the cities kind of look the same nowadays is not because like blue jeans or whatever are the most effective clothing ever invented. Like we're not trending towards one perfect norm. It's just because of American hegemony over culture. I mean, that's what America exports. It exports its own culture by force, mostly. Japan and Germany and all those countries that America defeated in war, they're basically forced to adopt a variety of American norms. And so if America, breaks apart and loses its hegemony, then I think that, things like clothing, architecture, general tastes will diverge again, because there's no longer one thing in control of everything. I mean, you can see how the Roman Empire did this, because everyone knows what a Roman sword looks like. But to a degree, one of the popular Roman swords was actually invented in Spain. But then, Rome kind of inspired Spain to make a new sword, but then Rome took that sword. And so, there's one Roman sword across the entire empire, just like how you said the M4 all looks the same. Different countries adopt different versions of the M4.
And I think one of the other things, and this is something you've seen as well, because NATO is a perfect example of this. And I'll stick with the arms and armor. Is it quite literally is a homogenization of the empire, and for a while, the French held out, and they had their different, relatively old, armories and foundries, but kind of slowly as the, war became more and more, especially for Europe, kind of economized, right? Like they didn't want to spend more than they had to, because they had the US kind of backing them up. Again, it became harder and harder to justify these distinctions, because again, war was a spreadsheet. And it always, I guess, to a certain degree has been. But again, all of the distinctions that we even did still have, in the era of, mechanized warfare kind of slowly went away. And in much the same way that you've seen this with consumer goods, where over time we've gone from being, kind of a variety of different firms making products to effectively like one or two large companies making almost everything. And again, that's only enabled by the fact that we live in an empire, right? That's only enabled by the fact that we essentially have one system of, rule, at least in most of the first world.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, if the empire falls, then the way the empire does things will fall. Just as when Rome fell, you started getting more distinct flavors of warfare. So, for example, the Norsemen, they had their, round shields and their broad, simplistic swords. And, Italy eventually diverged into using crossbows, all that sort of thing. Whereas under Roman influence, either you were in the Roman legions or you're getting your ass handed to you.
One of the things that I think is interesting is that we're sort of seeing the reintroduction of mercenaries on kind of like the world stage. And obviously there have always been mercenaries, kind of prominently in the Cold War. There were a lot of mercenaries, right, in South America, in Africa. And it's interesting that now kind of like the major world conflict is being, fought more and more by these kind of like PMCs. And to me, it reminds me very much of kind of, the Renaissance, right, in which we had, Swiss and Scots and, various varieties of Germans essentially like wandering all over the world as soldiers of fortune. And it's interesting in the sense that I think within that there is a natural urge to kind of, distinguish yourself, to make yourself look, kind of like outlandish and interesting, when you are sort of trying to, I guess, like make a name for yourself. And I'm curious to see how that will go.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've been kind of excited by the resurgence in mercenaries since I was a teenager, because even before the Ukraine war, the US was deploying contractors just at an insane scale for their recent wars in the Middle East. They didn't just do things like help with cooking or whatever. I mean, mercenary outfits often served as security details for important people or for bases. And they served as quick reaction forces for groups that got into trouble. So yeah, the mercenary is definitely coming back in a big way. And yeah, I think you're right that the nature of the mercenary means that they're probably going to be someone who wants to distinguish themselves. And so they'll end up with their own sort of brand. I mean, in the modern sense of the word, but also the classic sense, just like how in the past you had, the Swiss and the German mercenaries who didn't just have like distinct styles for the cantons they came from, but also had personal distinct styles, like the cut of their clothes or the colors they wore.
No, definitely. And to me, going back through your work, while we're here and seeing in addition to older men, you have a series of illustrations of essentially like young boys, training. And I think that as war has become something far away for most first worlders, right, that violence is something that happens elsewhere. I think that tradition, that kind of like not comfort, I guess, but that familiarity with, real, genuine physical danger has faded. And with that, I think has been a loss of something important. And I think that it's easy to decry, and I have often decried, right, the fact that for the vast majority of Americans, it is less safe than it has been, and within kind of recent living memory. But I think that there's also something to be said for the fact that, the safety has sort of made us soft, if you catch my drift.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, people kind of want the white picket fence life, but I really do think that kids need to be not necessarily all raised as warriors, but they do need to understand that the world can be a place of hard knocks. And yeah, I mean, especially if you want to create a new warrior class, all of the past warrior classes were not, it wasn't until you turned 18 that you could, become a warrior. It was something that you did from a young age. Knights and samurai all trained from about age 5 or 6 onwards in the martial skills. It's just, and also even in sci-fi settings, for example, Dune, I know that Dune implies that the main character, the young prince, was trained in martial skills from a young age. That's just something you have to do. I mean, if you want to walk, you have to learn to walk from a young age. And if you want to fight smoothly, you have to be fighting from a young age. That's just how it is.
No, definitely. And I think that there's a sort of doomerism, right? That is, things are getting worse, and kind of this misery porn that infects certain parts of our scene. But I think that the problem is that, and this is a point I take from de Maistre, that in order to get better, things must get worse, right? That the way you get out of corruption, the way that you get out of a downward spiral is essentially you have to pay for it. There's no cheating that. And that's not necessarily a comfortable process, that much like, and this is a truth from, like the necessarily like the Western canon, but right. But like the cost is blood, right? You have to give up, sometimes your own, sometimes others, right? But there has to be a rejuvenation in that. And I think that there's a desire to essentially like will it back to how it was when it was better. And to me, at least, and I don't know if I'm speaking too broadly here, but I think that if we accept that modernity isn't going so hot, to put it mildly, then I think we're going to have to accept the fact that we're going to have to sacrifice. We're going to have to kind of die a little bit to get out of this, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, you're completely correct. There is like some people have a desire to just kind of, let's go back to the 90s. Everything was fine then. Let's just turn back the clock and go back there. But no, it's like being ambushed. If you're ambushed, you're taking losses. The enemy has put you into place, a kill zone where it is a perfect spot for them and a terrible spot for you. And the only way out is through. You have to get out of the kill zone. And yes, you will lose people getting out of the kill zone, but you're going to lose everyone if you stay inside the kill zone. That's just that is just the nature of the beast. And in my art, I haven't depicted it yet. Most of my stuff is all this sort of idyllic. After everything has transpired, you get to be on the streets of Cascadia or Atlantica if you're attractive girlfriend in your cool clothes. But I am going to depict it in the art book where there is going to be a phase where America has kind of tripped over and fallen, and you're just going to get mass deaths due to things like logistical starvation, or small scale civil wars, those sorts of things. I mean, it's grim, but this is how it always transpires. That's just how it goes. Spangler, in his Decline of the West, I think he says that like normally these like collapses last 1,000 years, and he's not wrong. I mean, when it comes to the Roman Empire, Italy wasn't culturally relevant again for almost 1,000 years until the Renaissance got started. There's like dark times ahead, and you shouldn't view it as like, oh, how terrible. I mean, you shouldn't mope about it. Your children are going to be in a worse situation than you. I know the American dream is supposed to be, oh, my kids will have a better life than me. But materially speaking, they won't. And you should prepare them for that. You should understand that what's coming is going to be dark times. And that's just how it is. It's not like, you woe betide you. You just have to face it. Otherwise, you won't get through, and your kids certainly won't.
And I think that there is a sort of call to adventure in this. There's this moment in Beowulf, right, where Beowulf has essentially come to this to this hall, and everyone's sitting there eating, right, and Grendel kicks down the door, right, and in that situation, much like the kill zone situation you've described, it's like, well, you can't make it go away, right? It simply is happening. And so you have sort of two options, right? You can either run at the monster, you can run up the hill, charge the machine gun nest, so to speak, or you can cower under your bench, or you can sit on your belly and you can let it happen, and in each case, right, there's a distinct chance of physical danger. I'm not denying that, but it sort of is like, well, okay, like given that premise, what are you going to do about it? And to me, right, I think that there's a tendency on our side to want the solution now, to want this to work like Star Wars, where if you just fire the torpedo at the Death Star, it'll blow up and, the Empire will go away and you'll win all right now in 90 minutes. But I think you're right. And you're right to bring up, Spangler in this, in the sense that like these things take time, and they take a lot of time. And if you believe that this isn't just kind of like an internet LARP for you, then prepare for things to get worse, and prepare for things to get worse in a way that's not like cinematic or fun or cool. But anyway, I'm sort of stepping on you here.
No, you're correct. It's just things are going to get worse, and you're right. Exactly, it's not going to be a cinematic quick victory. And this is the way out of this. The way you get to whatever paradise you have in your head or whatever. It's not. It's a multi-generational thing. I mean, it truly is the blessed are those who plant trees in whose shade they will never sit, because there's really, I mean, you can kind of carve a little niche for yourself in these days, kind of relieve the pressure to what extent you can, but the general trend is downwards. Again, your kids will be suffering worse than you are, and their kids may be suffering worse than they will. And there's no point in bemoaning that. I mean, don't waste any breath of saying, oh, how terrible. This has happened before. It'll happen again after this phase as well. That's just how it is.
And I think there's also something to be said for the fact that like we're in a situation where we still have moves to make, that there are preparations that can be made. And I'm not saying this in kind of like a, live in a bunker with a million tins of beans sort of way, although, maybe that's better than nothing. But in the sense that like, if you see this coming, and maybe it's 20 years, maybe it's 40 years, maybe it's 2 years, but there are actions you can take to sort of ameliorate that, and I guess better 2 years of prep, better 4 years of seeing it coming than, waking up one morning and looking at your phone and seeing that, wait a minute, the power's off and it's not coming back on. And I don't mean to cast this in sort of a Mad Max light. That's not what I mean, but just in the sense that like, look at other countries that are sort of starting to fray at the edges and see what happens there. And I think that maybe that's not how things would have happened if the country looked like it did 60, 70 years ago. But I think there is certain truth in the idea that, when you import the third world, you get the third world. And I think that the term Brazilification is probably a good guess.
Exactly. I mean, Brazilification or South Africanization, that really is what we're trending towards, slowly or quickly. And exactly, there's value in carving breathing room for some people. That's kind of what Trump was or whatever. That's what voting correctly is supposed to get you, breathing room. That is not to say that, if we just elect the correct president, everything is going to go back to the 90s. That's not what's going to happen. You should just view it as, okay, well, the boot isn't on my neck as hard for now. I can operate more freely. I can build an institution or have a successful business or whatever, something that will, if not survive, then at least carry some fruits forward to the next generation. That's the value in breathing room.
And I think that there's also something to be said for the fact that in addition to kind of like romanticizing victory, there's sort of a fantasy of collapse in a certain way. That there's this whole, and it's not a sphere that's necessarily connected to ours very well, but there is a whole nother sphere of, I don't even say they're right, but kind of like dissident politics, or, essentially anti-system kooks, maybe a better way to put it, who are kind of like obsessed with this. And I use the term Mad Max, but this kind of like Mad Max version of the collapse, the big igloo, kind of all of this. And to me, I look at a place like South Africa, and you see how long it took South Africa to burn, really. I mean, it took plus or minus 30 years. And South Africa was a wealthy African country, right? But it was nowhere near as wealthy as, most Western countries. And so I do think that there will be a long period of looting. I think we're probably at the start of it, and I think that trends will continue. And when it comes to things like, and I had a railroad engineer on to talk about it, but when it comes to things like the breakdown of infrastructure, the essentially like impossibility of people like, you and I, Drawthentic, to go to prestige institutions. I think that those trends will continue apace and only get worse. But I don't think that means that tomorrow, like cannibal weirdos in BDSM gear will start like, smashing windows and eating people.
Yeah, I mean, the attraction of the Mad Max world is that it's a world where there is no supreme authority, and so you can take what you will. And logically, in a sort of Mad Max scenario, you would almost instantaneously get a sort of feudalism. There would be a sort of warlord period, and of course, feudal lords really are just warlords, but there almost instantaneously would be a better order in such a scenario, simply because there's nothing else to oppose it. Whoever can give his people more security in a Mad Max scenario will get a bigger population base and more stability for himself. But of course, we're not going to have a world where there is no supreme order, at least not instantaneously. It'll just be a decaying order, similar to how in South Africa, if South Africa was Mad Max, then it would actually be a better place than it is right now, because the people who suffer under its current conditions could just carve out their own little niche and do their own thing, deal with whoever attempts to take their stuff however they want to deal with them. But they can't. I mean, if a South African, builds an armed compound or whatever, or, if someone just shoots a robber, he'll probably just go to jail, because even though the state can't enforce any sort of domestic order, it can enforce draconian measures on those who attempt to protect themselves from the order. I mean, that's what anarcho-tyranny is, whether it's deliberate or not.
And I think that is another kind of like silver lining to the cloud over the horizon, right? And that's that if you can broadly define the right as being pro-order and pro-hierarchy, right? We live in a horribly decayed hierarchy, where people who, and I'm not going to flatter myself and say I should be the top tier of society, but I do feel this feeling like, I am being held out, like the place where, someone like me, 50, 100 years ago is no longer available to me, right? That has been given over to others and given over to people who don't necessarily deserve it. And, when to me, I think of this, there was a video a few days ago of essentially like some, schizo black guy on a subway, just berating this white family, just saying like all awful things about them, kind of like weird schizophrenic Hotep stuff, right?
Yeah, I just saw before Auron's video on it.
Yeah, and that was a good video. But the fact that, according to the regime, to the people in power, that guy is over me. That guy is over you. And unlike, a feudal lord, he has all of the benefits of power, none of the responsibility, and, essentially no justification for being there outside of just kind of like hatred of, the productive, core of society. And again, obviously, like the goal is not to stay in a warlord state forever, but there is something honest about that. That is a way that humans have ordered themselves at many times. And there is a sort of natural merit and hierarchy to it that I guess is somewhat appealing.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the fundamental issue of democracy, because democracy just lies about itself. It says, oh, the people have power, the populist delusion and all that. Whereas, feudalism is more honest. I mean, again, feudal lords are just warlords. They're a guy who has, troops under him, and he says, okay, well, I'm in charge. I have the true monopoly on violence because I'm in charge of these troops. So I am going to tax you. But in return, I want to keep my tax base alive. So I will protect my tax base from other invading threats. It's honest about itself. There is a degree of political formula, as Juvenal says. Feudalism sometimes results in divine right of kings, but that wasn't originally how feudalism defined itself. But it's considerably more honest than people power democracy or whatever.
And I think that there's also something about that honesty that is sort of appealing, right? So I recently went through for work, a long, kind of like, I guess, like sojourn in through bureaucracy, right, in the castle, so to speak. And it's so incredibly frustrating when you're at someone's mercy and you don't know who you are accountable to, who is in charge of the situation. It's just a form that goes off into the ether. And obviously, I'm not trying to over romanticize feudalism, because with any system there is corruption, and that's not my point. But there is something about, like, oh, you're in charge because you live in the biggest house and you get to sit on the chair, And so when everyone says who's in charge, you're like, oh yeah, that guy, where versus this kind of like faceless, amorphous blob of ugly people, that seems to control so much of our daily lives.
Yeah, your description reminds me, I don't know if you saw it, but there's an Asterix movie, probably a comic as well, where Asterix and Obelix get caught up in a Roman bureaucracy. They keep getting bounced around between different offices and not making any headway until they turn the bureaucracy on its head and they try and get the bureaucracy to be bureaucratic to itself. But anyway, yeah, I mean, the idea of bureaucracies and those sorts of things is that, oh, they're an independent institution. They'll arbitrate things fairly and objectively. A king won't. A king is just he's just a guy. I mean, he's biased. That's not really true. I mean, yes, if you get in a dispute between, like, yourself and the king's, I don't know, sister or whatever, he'll probably be biased. But I mean, most of the times he'll actually be considered to be unbiased because he's just so above it all. It's like, okay, well, this peasant says this land belongs to him, but this peasant says it belongs to him instead. They're both peasants in my eyes, so I'll just, see what my advisors think is going on and decide based on that. Whereas in the bureaucracy, there'll be all sorts of things where, who trained the bureaucrats? I mean, they're going to come from a university, and so the university is going to teach them certain things, and so they will side with what the university told them to side with. Or, it'll be, who the heck is that little bureaucrat's boss? I mean, if their boss is some fucking insane madman, then, I mean, they're responsible to their boss. So they will just do what their boss wants them to do, whether or not their boss is insane.
And this is a point, and the only reason I'm referencing De Juvenal so much is I read about 100 pages of De Juvenal today, and so it's sort of filling up my head. But he made this point about the French Revolution, right? Which is that this new republic, is supposed to be, a representation of, the will of the populace. But he looks at it and he says, well, these three republics made, or these three constitutions, featured millions of laws, right? Literally millions, several orders of magnitude more laws than had been ever enacted in the entirety of French history were done by the French Revolution. And he basically says is like that's absurd. The idea that, by definition, that a monarchy is this just like oppressive, hand constantly looking for more parts of your life to dominate, kind of this like 1984 world is absurd, right? Just because power is limited by the fact that it's held by so few hands, that in addition to whatever the king wants to do with his own time, he just simply doesn't have the man hours devoted to, ruling your life. Whereas if you have the Department of X, the Department of Y, you have hundreds of people whose job it is to manage, any one thing about your life. And I think we've seen this very much in the US with housing, right? Like there are so many, I guess, like niche things you need to satisfy to build a house that it makes it impossible to build houses. Whereas the king's like, I don't know, man, like I just put a shack together. I don't care. You're on my land. Just make it nice. And again, I'm not trying to over romanticize it, right? Like the king has a dungeon with, like chains and whips that he can peel your skin off in. But, realistically, right? Like we still have Gitmo. Like, does that make it better just because it's manned by, a series of, 350-pound Shaniquas, right? Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, power is always the same. I mean, power reserves to itself the right to, punish and arrest and whatever, arbitrary or not. So there's no getting around that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, if you have a system where power is concentrated in the hands of a few, and only those few, it's not even distributed across any sort of department or whatever, then they don't even have time to bother. It's like C.S. Lewis said, it is better to be under the tyranny of a robber baron than under people who do things for your own good, because the robber baron might sleep, but the people who do it for their own good, they have no sleep and they feel justified in what they do all the time. It was like, I think it was Spengler who said that in a democracy, the goal of a democracy is to remove anyone who has the sovereign exception to distribute power across as broad a system as possible, because A, it means that no one can be blamed for any failure, and B, it makes it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It gets more and more powerful because its only interest is to increase in size.
And it's interesting too, because you and actually this is going back to the discussion on weapons, right? Which is that it seems like in whatever country he exists, the bureaucrat hates weapons. At least in the in kind of the non-explicitly state authorized sense. And obviously, like different city states have said, there are a number of German examples, basically like, no, you can't carry an axe in the middle of the city during the day, or you can't carry a dagger at night because you're probably a cut purse. Fair enough, that's not my point. But there is something in which the sense that because of the structure of feudalism, you have kind of a vested interest in making sure that your subjects are capable, hardy, warlike people, right? Because you might actually need them to fight a war, and obviously if it's your land, you own it as the king, right? You have a vested interest in making sure that it kind of grows over time, becomes more powerful for your progeny, right? And this is actually incidentally a point made by Hans Hermann Hoppe, who, despite being a libertarian, has a book that's about 2/3 based and 1/3 cringe, called Democracy, the God That Failed, that makes very similar points. But there is something in the sense that, like, the development of a professional standing military, right, the levée en masse, was on one hand a huge, I guess, like tactical advantage, because you could just take your entire country and essentially, like bum rush everyone around you. But it did change the nature of the soldier, right? And there's a whole number of Roman sources that talk about this as well, right? The transition from kind of like the hardy Roman, I wanted to say Roman yeoman, but that rhymes and sounds stupid, but the Roman, kind of like freehold farmer to the paid standing army. And I do think that is a sign of both obviously increasing power as an empire, but also a sign of an approaching decadence. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, I mean, mass armament, in terms of, like everyone being able to own a weapon. It kind of, you're right that bureaucrats don't want it, but other rulers are considerably more ambivalent about it. For instance, the founding fathers were obviously not bureaucrats. Their view of like gun ownership was not, you not only can be armed, but you must be armed. That was why they said every man is a member of the militia, not just, whoever happens to be at the meeting on that particular day. And yeah, the same thing happened with Rome. But you might also say, oh yeah, the levée en masse was like, and then, the World War is like, that was mass armament as well, but obviously it was not in the same sort of vein. I think it kind of depends on the actual overriding culture. Because, for instance, with the mass conscription in the world wars, the mass conscription occurred because you just needed that many troops, not because like there was any particular ideal in the armed man. Most casualties in World War I were caused by artillery, not by riflemen. The riflemen didn't really matter. Whereas, when it comes to civilian ownership of weapons in the Middle Ages, or if the founding fathers wanted to be able to own guns, it was because there was a distinct threat, both in typical society as well as from without. So it's a different situation.
Well, fair enough. There is, and I don't know, there is something that I think about, and you're right to bring up that kind of that sort of danger that necessitated these traditions. And when I want to be careful about this because I don't want to necessarily lend credence to this argument, but when lefties point out they'll be like guns have no place in a civilized society, they're not right, but they are sort of getting at something in the sense that this is a tradition that is a holdover from another time, and it's a holdover from a better time, right, where we were better men. But I think that there is and I see this especially because in the kind of like American gun culture, there is this kind of belief in, it reminds me very much of the term, ghost dancing that was kind of in vogue, 2 or 3 years ago, which is this idea that if we do the thing that we used to do, if we embody, if we have the gun, if we dress up like the patriot at the rally, if we use the Gadsden flag, then it will become like that again. And to me, it's an understandable reaction, but I don't necessarily see it as our way out of this. Do you get what I'm kind of, and I'm feeling this out as I say it. I'm not sure I quite have a point, but do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I mean, you're correct that like the material conditions, as in like being armed, do not actually manifest, whatever the previous state that you want was. But at the same time, it's like, when lefties say like, oh, you don't need a gun anymore. I mean, they will say that as they cause the conditions where you will once again need a gun. Yeah, I mean, if it was still 50s America, 99%, not 99%, but like, overwhelmingly European ancestry, then yeah, you don't need a gun. Of course, we'll also recall that during that time they had extremely lax laws. I mean, you could own automatics if you wanted to. I mean, you don't need a gun in that situation. But lefties will say that as they, increasingly make having a gun a necessity.
And I think that that's a good point. So we have 2 super chats, one of which I'm slightly offended by, but I will still read it nonetheless because they paid me. Trouble Armstrong says, Mr. Burden, to raise funds for the Beavers, would you personally infiltrate the Peter Thiel conservative gay pleasure palace and take one for the team? While I appreciate the $5 Canadian, I think I'm going to pass on that for obvious reasons. And then Lou Templar for $5 says, so Cascadia or Atlantica? I'll admit, I would live in Atlantica, but the girls from Cascadia look cuter. So who knows? I might have to move across the country.
That was the danger. I mean, I don't have a bias. I asked the question, what would happen if, this state was in charge? And it's not my fault that the eugenic Nietzscheans end up with more attractive women than the other classes.
Well, fair enough. So Drawthentic, we're coming up on time. Where can people find you if they want to, see more of your work, and where can they look for that upcoming art book?
Yeah, I mean, Burden kindly put my Twitter link in his description. You can just find me if you look me up on Twitter as Drawthentic. And as for when the art book will be done, I hope to have it done like around the middle of this year. It's taking a long time. And I haven't guaranteed that I'll publish with them, but I might publish with Antelope Hill. So that's where you'll be able to buy it if it comes out anytime soon.
Well, again, thank you so much for appearing. And I should say, guys, you should head over, because premiering right after this, Lou Templar, friend of the channel, and Arthur Dane, who's on a few weeks back, they're going to be on his podcast, Blood and Rain. So you should check that out, because Lou Templar obviously is how I met Drawthentic, and he's a pretty interesting guy. And again, thank you so much, man, for coming on. I really appreciate it. And to you guys at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.